Hello, and welcome to my channel, World Traveler Commentary, where you get respectful discussions of current events. Now, I've decided to launch this channel with a three-part series discussing the problems that we have regarding the media. First part of this series will discuss the mainstream media. The second part will discuss the fringe media. And the third part will discuss social media. In my view, all of these have similar problems, partly because they have similar business models. In general, what you find is that the business model typically is advertising based, and this leads to particular incentives in terms of how to address readership. Now, this channel will never be very big because I'm not going to play this game. I think that the role that the media often plays is often very destructive. Not just regarding current events, but even if you look all the way back to the role of the media in setting up the Spanish-American War, again, it was all about selling newspapers, because selling newspapers is how you sell advertising. And you see, in fact, the same patterns that we see today. Now, if you're really interested in this topic, I'd recommend two books for you. The first is Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky, and there was a secondary author I can't remember the name of. And the second one is The Free Press by Hilaire Belloc, which was written about 100 years earlier. These two books discuss in significant detail some of the problems that the mainstream media faces in relation to covering topics successfully. However, in this case, I want to bring up a few general problems that the mainstream media has. Some of these are ones that are perfectly understandable and can't go away in any way, shape, or form. Other ones of these are, I'll probably be accused of being very cynical for saying this, but they're manipulative and they're profit-focused. So, let's start with the simple, sympathetic ones. When a news story breaks and the media goes out to take a look, there's only so much time that they have to go in and try to investigate and get some context for an event. A journalist going to an event that just happened isn't going to be able to have all the conversations needed to understand all of what led up to that event, right? And so, under the best of circumstances, the mainstream media can only provide a very thin veneer of information. They can't, for example, talk to you about how we got to a certain place until sometime after the event has taken place. So that's one major constraint that journalists face when they're working on these sorts of things. The second is institutional pressure not to rock waves. When Chris Hedges was, forced to resign from the New York Times, the big issue there was that he was speaking out against the Iraq War, and this would lead some people to think that maybe the New York Times wasn't neutral on the topic. Of course they weren't neutral, they were all for it. But, this veneer of neutrality is something which ends up being extremely pro-status quo in every way. And so this is the second major constraint. Those two things provide some restrictions under which the mainstream media operates that are independent of business models, right? They're fundamental to the basic promise of the media. And they give you they produce a number of problems along the way. But the really big problems that the mainstream media faces in terms of credibility and in terms of their impact on society don't come from those areas, they come instead from the business model of the mainstream media. The mainstream media, very much like all other forms of media, is an outrage industry. This is because the mainstream media, like the whole rest of the media, is an advertisement advertisement-driven industry. Being an advertisement-driven industry means you have to cultivate engagement, and nothing cultivates engagement better than people being upset and not angry. So when it was "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," which was newspaper headline that was instrumental in helping set off the Spanish-American War, for example. This was all about selling newspapers and therefore selling advertisement, and therefore improving the value of the newspaper to the advertiser, and therefore being able to charge more money for advertising. So, that was over 100 years ago. Very little has changed since then. So, the major, if you go back 50 years though, the major constraint that the media faced though was that you had a few, at least in the United States, you had a very few mainstream news channels. Everybody watched them. And therefore the mainstream media couldn't really play the divide and conquer game that we tend to see in the US today. If everybody's watching the same news reports, the media can't say, "Oh, look at those other guys who live across the street from you, they're the enemy. Look at all the crazy things they're doing, get you all riled up," and all this sort of thing. So what's happened since is you've seen the rise of Fox News, you've seen the rise of MSNBC, you've seen a number of other institutions in the United States in the media area which have directly employed this kind of tactic. And it's great for business. You gain a lot of viewers, and therefore you gain a lot of advertising. But look at what it does. It turns us against each other, and it means that instead of being able to discuss complicated and difficult issues, whether it's gun control or abortion or what right cultures have to chart their own way forward in the world, we're left with absolutist positions being pushed over the fear of what the other people might think or do. So this is a major problem. Now, Noam Chomsky talked a lot about the way in which the mainstream media tends to be dependent on governments for their source of information, and therefore tend to be extremely favorable to friendly governments. In other words, the governments of the people that they're trying to speak to, as well as maybe some other ones that they really, really want cooperation with. You see this, for example, in all of the discussion of whether Obama should kick out Fox News from the White House press briefings, or whether Trump should do the same to some other networks. These sorts of things, again, are all about sort of government domination of information sources. And although we like to think we have a free press, we really don't in that regard. We've seen, for example, CNBC remove posts at the insistence of foreign governments, for example, Ukraine. And again, this is because they want some cooperation from these governments in the future, and therefore are going to do what they need to do to secure that cooperation going forward. But that also means our reporting isn't unbiased. And that's one of the key things that we have to recognize from this. Another problem that Hilaire Bloch noted was that advertisers have an incredible amount of power over what a media organization can report on, because if advertisers start pulling their money, then media companies start losing revenue. So in most media, you're not the customer, you're the product. And the advertisers are the customer. And so that means that advertisers have massive amounts of power in the media. And what Hilaire Belloc pointed out is that usually this follows one of two patterns. The first one is that the media will be very selective about the stories it picks up if it might alienate advertisers. Belloc discussed in his book one example being the Marconi Scandal, which was a corruption scandal involving some large industry players, and it was a long time before the media reported on it, the mainstream media in his day, the big newspapers, but the socialist media had been reporting on it for some time. This was one of the reasons why, although he considered himself right of center, he also said he preferred to read the socialist newspapers over the corporate newspapers. The same thing happens today. Corporate malfeasance is not going to make a story unless the balance of advertising dollars weighs out in favor. The second thing that he points out is that the fact that sometimes advertisers, board members sit on board members of media companies tends to also undermine their independence. And so the mainstream media largely functions as a exponent of wealthy corporate interests. This is because that's who's paying their bills, it's because that's who's buying the advertising, and consequently you're being sold over to them. Now, what this means on the whole is that a lot of times what's actually going on is this business model where your mind and your emotions are being manipulated to follow a story over and over and over again in order to make more advertising money for whether it's the New York Times or MSNBC or Fox News. This is what's going on. And it's super, super important that that we recognize that. So that's all I have for you today. If you find this interesting, I hope I've earned a subscription from you and a like. What do you think about this topic? I'd love to hear from you in the comments. See you later.